what we think of in Western culture as a romantic relationship, including an abusive relationship, it won't start with a punch in the face. It will start with love and romance.
You are listening to the Why Smart Women podcast, the podcast that helps smart women work out why we repeatedly make the wrong decisions and how to make better ones. From relationships, career choices, finances, to faux fur jackets and kale smoothies. Every moment of every day, we're making decisions. Let's make them good ones. I'm your host, Annie McCubbin, and as a woman of a certain age, I've made my own share of really bad decisions. Not my husband. I don't mean him, though. I did go through some shockers to find him. And I wish this podcast had been around to save me from myself. This podcast will give you insights into the working of your own brain, which will blow your mind. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording and you are listening on this day. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. Well, hello smart women and welcome back to the Why Smart Women podcast. Today, I have a guest who has flown up from Melbourne. I'm, as usual, broadcasting from Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. And now, Karen, I'm desperately worried I'm going to get your name wrong, so I'm just going to say it 3 times. Karen Bijkersma.
That's perfect.
Karen Bijkersma. Okay. Karen Bijkersma has flown up on a big jet from Melbourne to Sydney today to talk about something which is very important, devastating, and the effects of which we feel all around the world, and that is domestic violence. Is that what we're calling it, domestic violence?
Yes.
I don't think it should be called domestic violence because it sort of diminishes it in my mind. Do you know what I mean? It sounds a bit like it's just around knitting. It's not. It's got that sort of anodyne feel to it, the word domestic. Do you not think?
Domestic sounds rather outdated.
Oh, good point, yeah.
Yeah. It is household, family, partnered violence, maybe partnered or family violence.
The whole thing, I think, putting it in a family setting, because I know the police back in the day used to, when this was very, very highly underreported, was it not? Because the police were like, well, that's the family's business.
Yes.
Right, and that has certainly changed, has it not?
Absolutely. It's hard to make these definitions, first of all, around gender. We're talking about male to female violence predominantly, and then you feel you need to, define gender. What do we mean by domestic is another definition. And then there's the abuse, violence definition. And I haven't resolved all of those.
No, of course.
They used to be interchangeably.
And I know that they often say, well, why are we talking about, male to female violence? Like obviously men cop it as well, but at the centre of it, what we know is that even if the violence has been perpetrated on a male, it's much more likely to have been perpetrated by another male. Correct?
That's correct, yes. And the small number of women who do inflict violence against men in that domestic or household setting, it's usually in self-defence, and a very small number. I'm not too keen on the whataboutism, which often comes up, especially from men, I must say.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it is such a small percentage of women inflicting domestic abuse and violence on men. Yes, it happens, but we have the statistics from the police and the ABS that tell us it's a small number of women. So just
because we've got international listeners, what is the ABS?
Sorry, Australian Bureau of Statistics that collect this data. And the ABS recognises that 97% of sexual assaults in Australia are inflicted on women by men. So we're talking very small numbers. So I focus on women, and also that's my experience as a woman.
Yeah, so that's I think that's just really important to set the scene there, because we do hear a lot of this this whataboutism, and it really, really irritates me because at the end of the day, and we have the stats to prove it, women are the main recipients of this violence. So Karen has written a book, and the book is called The Book Every Woman Needs to Read. That's such a smart title. How did you come up with that?
Because it's just so true. We all need to know what domestic violence and abuse looks like. We need examples so that we can recognise it if it happens to us or somebody close to us, because sometimes it's actually quite tricky to recognise when it's happening to you. And I know in my own experience, it can take a while to actually see it and see things for what they are.
And so do you mind awfully talking about your own experience?
I don't mind. I think it's really important that we do share our stories and experiences so other women who might be able to relate can recognise, wow, this is abuse. This is similar to what's happening to me.
And do you think that women do miss some of the flags that would let them know that they are in an abusive relationship?
Absolutely. Unless it's really bleeding obvious, it can be hard to pick, especially when you're manipulated and exhausted and in confusion and drained and suppressed and oppressed when you're subject to abuse.
So because we like to talk about critical thinking, this is the fundamental of the podcast. So what are some of the abuses that may occur that women may not recognise that is happening to them? And how does that tiredness, how does that feed into that? How does that happen?
It's all about the power and control and manipulation, and men control women by manipulating them and confusing them, exhausting them, using psychological and emotional abuse as opposed or in addition to, I shouldn't say opposed, adjacent to or rather than physical and sexual violence, which is a lot more obvious.
Yeah, David, my partner, has did a TED talk on the psychological actions that people in power play to control. So I think this is where it gets really interesting, because it's, as you say, if someone's having violence perpetrated upon them, or if someone is, being screamed at on a daily basis, for instance, it's almost like we can go, yeah, okay, I get that. But what are these other abuses that may fly under the radar?
So psychological and emotional abuse can really erode a woman's self-confidence and self-esteem and make her more vulnerable and unable to take initiative. And he's doing this to her so that he can then take over her cognitive thinking, her decision-making processes, whether he's doing this deliberately or he just kind of instinctively knows the playbook. There are methods to more or less brainwashing and really taking over somebody's capacity to think. And she loses her critical thinking skills.
Right.
And at the same time, she's dealing with confusion and emotions and disbelief.
Can you give me an example? Because it sounds, as you're talking, it's redolent of being in a cult where you're confused. You sort of lose your centre of gravity. You sort of don't know where you are. You're tired and you're worn down. Is that right?
Yes, that's a really good analogy, actually. And yes, he's the cult leader.
Yeah, right.
And
Okay.
we're learning more and more about coercive control, which is a really important aspect or, behaviour, whole system of abuse that may or may not include physical and sexual violence.
Which is illegal now, is it not? Coercion and control.
In some states, we've still got a way to go around Australia, but in some states, and I don't know which off the top of my head.
I know New South Wales.
Right, okay.
So do you mind, can you give me a real life example, and maybe from your book? Because I know how many women did you interview for your book?
There are 28 stories in the book. But I did interview more women than that.
Right.
Some women got cold feet and pulled their stories because even though they're all really carefully de-identified, they are just afraid of, waking the sleeping dragon.
Oh, my God, so terrible.
It really is, yes. So the control goes way beyond leaving the relationship. And in fact, the first period after leaving the relationship is actually the most dangerous time.
So they say.
And now there's recognition, just going back to coercive control, when a woman is murdered by a partner or ex-partner, which is now happening at the rate of more than once a week.
Oh, my God,
there's databases you can follow online. The Red Heart campaign tells us 16 women and 5 children have been killed already this year. Often when those cases are examined by police, there's a story of coercive control leading up to that, sudden extreme violence, that murder. So coercive control is really a step-by-step process.
Yes, insidious, isn't it? It's really an insidious...
Yeah, it starts small. Well, it starts with love. It starts with love bombing.
What do you mean by that?
Well, an abusive relationship, unless it's, say, a slavery or forced marriage that's violent kind of situation, what we think of in Western culture as a romantic relationship, including an abusive relationship, it won't start with a punch in the face. It will start with love and romance. And
what happens, if you got an example of, in one of your stories, of a relationship that did start out with love and then sort of went in this direction that isn't an obvious example of physical violence or sexual violence? Have you got an example for me?
There is. There's one story, I think her name is Mia, and I'll just check while I'm talking.
Please feel free to read it if you like.
Well, it's a whole long story. Okay, so chapter 17, Micah's story, Psychopathic Tendencies, is a classic playbook, step-by-step process case of coercive control, where, it starts with a romantic relationship with a very charming man. She says, he was very charming and attentive. He had a knack of saying all the right things. He told me how much he respected women, that he wasn't like other men, etc., etc. In the early days of dating, we had fun. Things were carefree. And then 2 paragraphs down, from the beginning of the relationship, once they were living together, he controlled practically every aspect of my life. And it starts with him not allowing her to use the gas heating over winter.
What? Why?
And just out of control. Not allowing her to buy the children a warm winter jacket when they're outside in the cold on a holiday, but he goes and buys himself a very expensive jacket from a mountain shop. And it's even in very small ways that he controls, although neither of those are a small thing, because proper clothing, is a human right.
It's a bit of a fundamental.
Yeah.
Explain to me, if you don't mind. So she's fallen in love with this man who's charismatic, and then he starts to exhibit these controlling behaviours. So what happens to her thinking that she doesn't just go, well, I'm getting out of here because you're clearly revolting? What happens? Can you explain to me?
Because it's really a step-by-step process. It's that frog in the pot analogy where...
What is that?
If you don't know that, And this was my situation too in my long-term relationship. You put a frog in a pot of cold water and the frog's perfectly happy.
Yeah.
And you put it on the stove, you apply a bit of heat, and gradually the water gets hotter, but the frog keeps adjusting.
Acclimatising.
Bit by bit, yes. And then eventually, of course, it comes to the boil, and it's, the end for poor froggy.
Yep.
It's that slow death, that slow burn, or that building, starting with small things and then building up. And by the time a woman realises that, well, she may not actually realise herself. In the example of Micah, which is not her real name, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
It took, I think, a GP or somebody she saw on a professional basis to tell her, you do realise he's controlling your every move. And that was news to her because it had been so slow and so orchestrated. There were things she was unhappy about, and she could feel that she was cold, and, she tried to keep the children warm and that sort of thing. She developed strategies, and this
around
is what women do. So she would have the heating on but turn it off before he came home.
Oh my God. And
she would shower early so he wouldn't complain about hot water. She would bathe the children early so he wouldn't know she'd used water. All these strategies she built around his controlling behaviour.
And didn't recognise them.
But also it kept her very busy. And
tired,
exhausted, and at the same time he's socially isolating her. She's not allowed to use
back
the phone.
to the cult, right?
Yes,
it's so
back to the
cultish.
cult.
Yeah.
Yes, and just wearing her down, eroding her confidence by saying really undermining things to her.
Yep.
Sexually abusing her and really, really breaking her down. And she is so busy working so hard to implement all these strategies around all his rules and appear to keep all his rules. She's exhausted. Her thinking
Hence the no
processes.
leaving, right? Hence, because I know there's a mantra that I hear all the time, which is, why don't they just leave? Why don't women just leave?
And there are so many reasons.
And what are those reasons?
So frustrating. Yes, or why didn't she leave sooner?
Yeah.
And she's under coercive control. She's psychologically and emotionally broken down. She's dealing with the fact that she has to come to terms with the emotional dissonance of, but this is the person I love and this is the person who loves me, and I can't believe this person's doing this to me. It takes time to absorb it unless it's really obvious. It can take time to realise things like, in my experience, my long-term ex's jokes, for example. I didn't realise just quite how undermining and how many of these family jokes had crept in to the dynamic.
What? Do you remember any of the jokes?
Oh, for sure, yes.
Some of the more
insidious. Yeah. And it's, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
So what were the jokes? Do you remember?
One was whenever we were watching, say, a film noir or a Nordic noir TV program or movie, and there'd be a corpse on the slab, or there'd be a corpse washed up on the beach, or wherever there's a corpse, if it was a female, as it so often is, he would say, he'd sort of dig me in the ribs and say, oh, you could play that role. And I'd say, that's not funny. And he'd be kind of like, well,
can't
you take a joke?
Yeah, there it is, right? There it is.
But that's, one, not funny.
It's not funny.
Two, insulting.
Yeah.
And if he'd said that to me at the point where I had divorced him, but we were still stuck in the house together, I would be calling the police, because that's actually very threatening.
It is really threatening.
And menacing.
Yeah,
it's not a joke at all. And so there were that was probably the worst, but there were lots of these little jokes.
Yeah.
Family jokes that are very undermining.
In my In my first book, Why Smart Women Make Bad Decisions, I wrote it because I recognise that women's critical thinking is under-indexed in terms of us making good decisions.
Yeah.
And I wrote in it, and he was the character that I wrote who never had a name, and I deliberately never gave him a name. I just called him the hipster. And the reason I didn't was because I wanted it recognised that his behaviour was ubiquitous. And he was narcissistic and very, very spiritual. Mm-hmm. So he had... he had the whole beautiful yoga practice, and he endlessly meditated, and he was vegan, and he was sort of on the outside. If you met him, very good looking, very charming, very nice at the beginning. On the first night they met, he said to her, "We will be together forever. We will grow old together." So it was like, to your point, it's super romantic.
Yes,
this idea. And then what happens is, as the relationship goes, he begins these insidious coercion and control. She can't meditate properly. She can't sit straight enough. He can't find the remote, and she knows that if he can't find the remote, it's going to get dangerous, because what he does is he starts ripping up the lounge room and throwing things, and yet it's always him that loses it.
And that's symbolic violence. That throwing of things.
Oh, explain that to me. Symbolic violence. That's
symbolic violence, which is increasingly recognised as, actual physical violence, is, when they punch a wall next to your head.
Yep.
They get all up in your face and tower over you. They use physical intimidation.
Right. Yeah.
And the message is, if they punch a wall or throw something or break something, you were lucky that time, but next time it's going to be you. Or I punched the wall, but really,
it could have been your
head,
face.
I'm punching your face. Yeah.
It's such a good point, because, as I said, he was an amalgam of relationships my friends had.
Right.
And I had a relationship in my 20s. It was prior to my very nice, reasonable husband that I now have. I had this relationship in my 20s with a yoga teacher, and he was all into the whole... spiritual thing. And he did that very thing. He punched the wall next to my head. Now, I had never had... I come from a very, very stable, loving background. This behaviour was so alien to me that I immediately... got out of the relationship.
Right.
Actually, that's not true. It took a couple of months, but I began to sort of recede, and I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. And he had all this spiritual crap. God, I hated it. Anyway, and then there was my friend, and this is the amalgam of this narcissistic character. And my friend was married to this man, and he used to get drunk and then flirt outrageously with her friends. And on my wedding day, when I was getting married, he was there. And he put his hand up inside my wedding dress.
Oh, wow.
Which was, I don't know, I thought that was impressively revolting.
That's shocking.
Yeah, that's out there,
in
right?
so many ways.
In so many ways.
Yeah.
And
what a nerve.
Yeah. Anyway, and then I wrote that into the book. I wrote the fact that they go to a wedding and the hipster puts his hand up the bride's dress, and then in the cab on the way home, she says, "You're lucky the groom didn't punch you." And he says, "That pudgy baby wouldn't have had a hope." The pudgy baby groom, right? So, and also when they get home, he's like, "You need to go and get help. You've imagined it."
Wow.
So it's that whole
That's
sort
classic.
of panoply,
Yes.
right, of these narcissistic, gaslighting, controlling things.
Yes.
But if you looked at the relationship from the outside, you'd go, he's so lovely.
Yes, and so spiritual too. So he must be a good guy.
Yeah.
And it was like that with my ex too, who was such a feminist.
Oh, really?
And, such a lefty, but such a feminist and such a nice guy that it was hard for me to believe, even as I was being undermined and as he was undermining our daughter.
Oh, so you
Not
had
our
children
son,
with him.
Yes, a son and a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
The son was excluded from all the abuse and manipulation and undermining. So it was very much gendered. It was my daughter and I.
Wow.
Yes, and he would
Poor daughter.
Yes, I know. And so, it's been very traumatic for her, and she's had a lot to try and overcome because he really worked on her self-esteem, and he would make jokes at her expense to undermine her. For example, if we were driving past a factory, invariably he would say, "Oh, that's where you're going to end up working." Or if it was something like a prison or police station, "Oh, that's where you're going to end up, in juvie." And so he thought these were jokes, but it really, really
it's not funny, and it's not a joke.
And
it's not a joke.
It's not a joke at all. It's like
so
that corpse
abusive
comment.
Yeah, it's awful.
And so he was really trying to undermine the confidence and sense of security for both of us.
Well, we know that, and I was interested in the excellent list you've got here of why women stay or stay too long. So we make an emotional decision. So if I'm in an abusive relationship, I don't want to get out of it for a number of reasons. It could be financial. I may not have recognised it, whatever it is, and I'm going to post-rationalise it in the prefrontal cortex, and we know this is the process. Motivated reasoning, going to reach a conclusion that I want to reach. And I'm particularly interested in the use of, look, everything's perfect except for this one thing.
Yes.
I find that so interesting and so sad. Do you want to talk me through that?
Yes, I've seen that so often, and I've experienced that myself, where everything's great, but there's this one big thing. It could be an addiction or...
Hang on. So one big thing is he's addicted? No, I'm addicted.
Talking about one big thing with him, that everything's great in a relationship and with him. He's great, except there's this problem he has that he doesn't address. And he may promise that he will address it, but he never actually does. It could be that he has an addiction.
To like alcohol or drugs or something?
Yes, exactly.
And the result of that addiction is what?
Well, toxic for the family. The whole household suffers.
Right.
But also it often fuels domestic violence. These stories I collected from 28 or more women. Drugs and alcohol feature very heavily in a lot of the stories.
Right.
And there's often a Jekyll and Hyde effect where he's a great guy until he drinks, then he turns violent, then he turns nasty. And if he won't address that alcoholism, then that's who you're living with. But women keep hoping he will, or he keeps promising he will, or he makes some feeble attempts that keeps her hopes alive that he will.
So what happens? He gets
serious.
drunk. So he gets drunk. He becomes violent.
Yes.
Maybe perpetrates violence on the family. Gets up the next morning, goes, "I'm really sorry. I won't do it again."
He's sober and sorry.
He's sober and sorry. And of course, then the woman's critical thinking skills, in which you would like her to be able to look at the evidence of the whole situation and the facts of the whole situation, are diminished, the critical thinking skills, and motivated reasoning kicks in, and then she goes, "He means it, I'm going to give him another go."
Yes, because he's very sincere, and he may actually believe it himself when he apologises and cries and maybe even threatens self-harm because he feels so bad.
That's the other thing.
Yes.
Is when we've done quite a bit of work for Hume Housing in Sydney, and they provide emergency housing.
Right.
Part of what they do public housing, but part of it is emergency housing. To victims of family violence. Mm-hmm. Often they're relocating a woman and her children in an emergency situation. To your point, the most dangerous time for any woman is the first 24 hours, correct? Yeah.
Yes. As you're leaving or just afterwards.
That's right. And when we were working for them, we were going through communication skills with them, because that's what we do as a business. And I got to travel around with one of the social workers from New Housing, and she was telling me that if a woman is relocated due to domestic violence, they often have to relocate her 7 times because what happens is they relocate. Everything's in a highly aroused state. Everyone's upset. It's dangerous. It's awful. And then she gets back in contact with him. He says, "I'm sorry." She gives him the address, and so it goes.
There's a cycle, and it's called the cycle of abuse. Right. And yes, we should talk about this for a minute.
Please describe that. It'd be great. I'm not great. It's awful.
Because it's really important, and domestic violence workers use this illustration. I've got the chart in my book. It's a cycle. You can find it on the internet, the cycle of abuse. And when women are shown this cycle, this graph, there'll often be a moment of, great clarity. The penny will drop. They can see it. It's very hard to see it when you're in it because it erodes your critical thinking capabilities. What it does is create a chemical addiction and dependence. Now, he may not be aware of this.
It's a dopamine thing.
It's a dopamine thing. And the cycle is, and as soon as I say it, I'm sure it will sound very familiar. Yes, it was developed by an American psychologist in the 70s, Lenore Walker, but it's still used today. It's still really helpful. It is a very familiar pattern. He might feel pressure from family or work or whatever. He doesn't know how to deal with it in a healthy way, or, he gets drunk or whatever happens. So tension builds at home. She starts sensing it, starts walking on eggshells and tries to, keep the peace, tries to keep the tension from bubbling over and escalating. But, of course, it does unleash the tension often onto the partner, physically or otherwise. He lashes out, and that gives him a sense of power and control where he might be feeling powerless at work or not in control of his health or whatever. Getting power and control over his partner makes him feel better. But then, so there's this big outburst, whatever that looks like. The next stage is reconciliation, to manipulate her into forgiving him and love bombing her with kind words. Maybe he buys her flowers, he's terribly sorry. And this sort of love bombing behaviour after the event
gives know,
her dopamine.
Of course it does, because in terms of we have this thing called hedonic adaptation. And hedonic adaptation is where when something's really good, you really, really want something.
Yes.
And then as soon as you got it, we sort of adapt, right?
Yes,
so
you need it again.
Yeah, you really want this relationship and you get the relationship and you're like, meh. Or you really want this award, or, you've written that book and it was, when did that come out, the book?
E-book in May and paperback in December.
Right. So when you first held that book in your hand, right, was it like the most unbelievably exciting thing?
Oh, yes. And then I wanted to publish more because it's really fun and exciting.
And it's fun and exciting. But the thing is that you can't maintain that level of excitement. It's called hedonic adaptation. Right. It happens with everything. And, of course, with relationships, it especially happens because we become acclimatized. So I guess it's interesting in this situation that you're talking about, where the love is destroyed temporarily, but then you're reintroduced. Yes. It would keep that level of that excitement up.
It brings it up
I can see why that would be addictive.
And it's a roller coaster, and you're living for the periods of repair and reconciliation.
Yeah, makes sense.
And you might have great make-up sex.
Yeah.
It can be a romantic time, and it releases dopamine and oxytocin, which bonds her
further to
closely to him. Yeah. And then there's a period of calm, and sort of in the aftermath, after the tears, There's a period of calm.
And he
and
said,
both
so sorry, I
partners-
love you so much.
Yes, so
Love you
he's
so much,
still
babe.
being nice. And they're both trying to justify the abuse, trying to justify staying in the relationship on her end. And he will blame other factors like work stress or whatever, minimising what he's done.
Absolutely minimising.
Scapegoating, or even, blaming her for provoking him. Look what you made me do.
Look what you made me do is classic, right?
Yes. If you hadn't done X, if you hadn't pushed me or nagged me, I wouldn't have erupted. And so he promises her it won't happen again. She accepts his excuses and downplays in her own mind, or even starts to blame herself, starts to gaslight herself.
So that was part 1 of my discussion with Karen Bijkersma about the insidious nature of partner and family violence. Please make sure you tune in next week to hear part 2, where we dig further into why domestic violence often flies under the radar. Every Thursday, my partner David and I, who have been together for over 30 years, will have a bonus episode where we'll discuss all things relationship. This Thursday, we'll discuss the Australian people's relationship with our government and why the Libs copped such a hammering. See you then. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to Why Smart Women with me, Annie McCubbin. I hope today's episode has ignited your curiosity and left you feeling inspired by my anti-motivational style. Join me next time as we continue to unravel the fascinating layers of our brains and develop ways to sort out the fact from the fiction and the over 6,000 thoughts we have in the course of every day. Remember, intelligence isn't enough. You can be as smart as paint, but it's not just about what you know, it's about how you think. And in all this talk of whether or not you can trust your gut, if you ever feel unsafe, whether it's in the street, at work, in a car park, in a bar, or in your own home, please respect that gut feeling. Staying safe needs to be our primary objective. We can build better lives, but we have to stay safe to do that. And don't forget to subscribe, rate and review the podcast and share it with your fellow smart women and allies. Together, we're hopefully reshaping the narrative around women and making better decisions. So until next time, stay sharp, stay savvy, and keep your critical thinking hat shiny. This is Annie McCubbin signing off from Why Smart Women. See you later. This episode was produced by Harrison Hess. It was executive produced and written by me, Annie McCubbin.